Randy, it's nice to catch up with you. And what I find, I love about our conversations is your willingness to be transparent in the role of superintendent and what you experience and the way in which you evaluate the market and what's going on, so that in essence we can all learn from it. Tell me about how the role of the superintendent, from your perspective, has evolved even since you've been a superintendent.
I think today, particularly in the world that we live in, superintendents need to have a much broader perspective of the world that we live in. And I think that in my case, one of the things that's really on my radar is the future and how we're preparing kids for that future. I've become very much interested, and I try to communicate this and share this with my colleagues as well. You read about things like artificial intelligence and virtual reality, and there are things that are happening now. There are signals out there of this changing world, and I fear that as superintendents, we're really not having that important conversation about those signals that are happening. What is that world going to be like, whether you're graduating in 2017 or 2035, as our kindergartners who are entering this year are going to graduate. And so I think the role of the superintendent now more than ever needs to be more visionary. It needs to take into consideration the changes that are happening in the context of the real world right now.
So this may be a leap, and correct me if I'm wrong, but could a critic say that lack of vision that you're speaking of, or I guess willingness to talk about what that future might look like, could that not be impacting the way in which we are managing our budgets at the district and the school level itself? And that, I think sometimes the general public thinks that a district struggles to manage the complexities of a school budget. And if you put that with potentially a lack of willingness just to have that day-to-day conversation that, look, if we're going to incorporate virtual reality, there's going to be a cost to that. What's going to go, or how are we going to then, account for that? Where does that, from the practical side, fit into the vision that you're talking about?
So one of the things that we've been doing in our school district over the last year and a half or so is working around a profile of a graduate, and then backing that up and saying, if this is our vision, if these are the competencies that we want our students to have, what does the learning environment need to look like? And having conversations around what are those learning beliefs. And I think that ties to a budget conversation or any conversation around resources and how do we allocate those resources based on that vision. And I think that a lot of the conversations that we have now in education are around a very narrow vision of education, a very, we're looking down, we're missing a lot of what's going on in the world. And those conversations around resources and budget aren't taking into consideration that wider vision. It's a very narrow vision it's oftentimes a vision, I think, that's pushed down on us. So we have the federal government that's creating a vision, and now we're in somewhat uncertain times as to what's going to happen with that vision. That gets projected to the state. The state becomes very compliant with the federal. The state then tells superintendents and school boards what to do. And so when it gets down to the building level, we get conversations that are around this very narrow vision of what is achievement, what is accountability. And as a superintendent, I think it's my role to push that conversation and say it needs to be a lot wider. And are we truly preparing our kids for this world that is really starting to develop exponentially too? Educational organizations are linear thinking organizations, and the world is, with technology, is changing exponentially. And so there's this increasing gap. Mm-hmm. And so how do our visions shift around that, and how do our conversations around how we allocate resources need to shift around that as well?
Let's close with this, Randy. One thing that I have been hearing recently that has been personally, inspiring, is that there are districts out there that are starting to ask very serious questions around the way in which we grade, the way in which we document learning. And you're seeing some shifts in some very traditional approaches to education, where taking away report cards at certain levels and finding different ways to approach the process of documenting skill acquisition, right? How do you look at that, and is that a good sign that we're seeing some movement, and is there enough movement going on?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question because it fits in with that idea of vision too. And if we want to prepare kids for the real world, how are we assessed and evaluated in the real world, in real world projects and real world tasks? It rarely is a grade. It rarely is a number. And that number and that grade has a long history that's grounded in a need of the system. And a lot of what's changing around the vision of education, the vision of learning, is how do we shift it from the needs of the system to the needs of the learner? And so asking the question, does the grade, the letter, or the number benefit the learner? And how does it benefit the learner? And is there something better that benefits the learner? And that something is probably more frequent and valuable feedback that comes in a conversation or in written feedback, as opposed to a letter grade or a number, which is oftentimes taking a whole bunch of different factors and bringing them down into one finite, easily consumable letter or number. And what meaning does that really have?
It makes our lives a little easier, doesn't it? And I say that in jest, meaning that we can put it on the shelf. We know where it goes.
Yeah. But is it? Are we trying to make life easier for the system, or are we trying to make the process of feedback more valuable for the learners? And I think that's a shift that's changing.